Thank you, I appreciate it.
All right, everybody, we're going to get started. Welcome to the February 2018 meeting of the CB1 Land Use, Zoning, and Economic Development Committee. My name is Patrick Cannell. I'm chair of the committee, along with Diana Sweetire, director of Planning and Land Use. To my right is chair of CB1, Anthony Notaro. We have a packed agenda tonight, so we want to get started right away. We've got three matters that are up for resolution that I expect some significant, or at least two anyway, that will have some significant discussion. But first, a presentation from China Prado from the Downtown Alliance, friends over there, about interactive art installations. China?
Oh. Hello, everybody. I'm China Prado, the Chief of Staff of the Downtown Alliance. And I'm here tonight to present to you our window art installation for the Water Street Pop Spaces. Early this year, we partnered with Creos to enliven the Water Street privately owned pop spaces. Creos is a Canadian company. It's an arts organization that tours interactive installations in different cities. They have done similar installations to this in DC, in Baltimore, in Scottsdale, in Montreal. They currently have an exhibit going on right now on Broadway in the Garment District, and they partner with the Garment District Alliance, the bid for the Garment District to present this initiative. The art installation is called Prismatica, that's the name. It consists of revolving prisms that give off a spectrum of color, different colors of the rainbow. It's a temporary interactive installation. They revolve, they're set up and designed for people to touch them, to take photos, to interact with them, and walk through the different prisms in these spaces. This board is very much aware of our commitment, the Downtown Alliance's commitment to activating the spaces along Water Street in different ways. For 3 to 5 years, we produced Game On, which is a free public programming summer block party along the corridor several years. This last year was our last summer doing it, so this winter we thought it made sense to do something in a different part of the season to enliven these spaces. It is our goal that Prismatica will enliven these dark spaces, especially along the area of Governor Lane. These are the 3 locations that we've selected to host the prisms. So there's 75 Wall Street, which is here, 77 Water Street, so this side of 77 Water, and 32 Old Slip. This being Governor Lane. It's a pedestrian thoroughfare, but these are the 3 locations where we will have the prisms located. On Monday, March 18th, we're having a community opening from 5 to 6 p.m. at 77 Water Street, where we're inviting local schools, some community organizations. We're hoping to get Pace University to come and do a performance as well during that time. And we're going to be partnering with some local businesses in the area to give out snacks and some giveaways to people who want to come. The exhibit will be on display from March 15th through April 21st for about 5 weeks. So it's a temporary installation. That's it. Any questions?
Questions? No questions? Fantastic. Run while you can.
Really?
Oh, I would be remiss.
I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
I'd be remiss
Just
if I
getting away.
You gotta go faster.
You thought I was getting away.
But you thought so, but with the Alliance,
Sure.
it's fantastic to have some sort of impermanent art thing, and I'm sure it'll be lovely. I know as a community board are very invested and interested in knowing what's happening in the permanent streetscape there, and particularly at 200 Water Street. I'm just curious, I know this isn't in your particular area, but we'd love to know what's happening with the pops there. I know there was a lot of promise of a lot of development there.
As I understand, the applicant came to the community board, Rock Rose, ownership of that building came and presented what their plans were. I believe they're going through their process. They're the only property owner along the corridor that have decided to take advantage of the zoning text amendment and make certain improvements and changes to the plazas and to the space. I don't can't report on any other buildings.
How about 7 Hanover Square? We've read about some development in the arcade there. Is that something
I
you're
read something
aware
about in
of?
the article in the press about infilling or
The
doing some
arcade
of the
there,
arcade space.
Do you know anything more about that?
I don't, but I can sort of get some, regroup with them and come back again if you have people have questions.
Thanks very
Sure,
much.
sure.
Joe?
Some people don't think it's an improvement, what's being done down here.
Relating to
No.
this? Oh, okay.
Rock Road.
To the 200, yes. I know that was taken very seriously by the community board, absolutely.
Call the question.
There's nothing to call. It's
Oh, we
just
don't have to
informational.
approve?
Yeah.
No,
So,
this is just
thank
the
you,
only
Tina.
coming to be,
It's from
Oh,
March
man.
18th to
I'm
when?
sorry, what?
When's the date, March 18th?
Yes, Monday, March
Till-
18th, 5 to 6.
Till April?
Oh, sorry, to April 21st.
Thank you.
The prisons will go in March 15th, which is a Friday. They'll take a few days to set up, but it'll officially open on the 18th and run through April 21st.
Thank-
A rough idea, how many
No
of
questions,
those
what happened?
are at each installation?
I'm
do
sorry,
you know?
what?
How many of the prisons
Oh, sure, so I
are
have,
each-
yes, I have that. I can go back to the map. So, at 77 water, there'll be 9.
Wow.
At 77 water, there'll be 9. At 32 Old Slip, here, there will be 11. And at 75 wall, there'll be 5.
So at 77 Water, they're sort of infiltrated with all of the art that's already there. They're kind of
They're on
part
the
of.
side.
They're
the
just
art
on
is
the
mo-
side.
The art is mostly on this side of the plaza.
So 77 Water, they're not in the plaza, they're in the.
They're right here, the red out, sorry, you can't see that well, but the red outline space is where the prisons will be.
Right.
The rest of the blue part is the entire
Got
plaza,
it.
but the prisons will only be within that red line.
Thank you.
Sounds neat. Thank you, Tina.
Thanks.
We look forward to it.
Bravo.
All right. Second item on our agenda is the residential tower mechanical voids zoning amendment. And here to present are our friends from the Department of City Planning. Allison is going to start us off.
I just want to introduce myself. My name is Stephen Johnson. I'm with City Planning. I'm taking over from where Richard Suarez was the team leader for Community District 1 and 5. So if you have any questions about this project or anything related to your community district, my phone number is 720-3457, 720-3457. And of course, Allison is our community planner liaison for this district, and she's doing a great job.
Your name?
Stephen Johnson, thank you. And we've been working on this project for a while, and we're happy to bring it to you here tonight and go through the presentation. I'm also here with Kiyoshi Yamazaki from the Department of City Planning, who's our zoning expert, and we'll be happy to answer any questions after the presentation. So, thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting us to speak here tonight. So Stephen mentioned I'm going to be doing citywide text amendments for residential tower mechanical voids. This was certified by the City Planning Commission January 28th. The referral period started February 8th and goes until March 8th, just to keep in mind. So we're here today because our current New York City zoning resolution allows mechanical floor space to be excluded from zoning floor area calculations, and there are no explicit height limits on these spaces. However, recently some developments have utilized excessively tall mechanical floors so that upper story residential units are located above the surrounding context. So last year, Mayor de Blasio asked DCP to examine the issue of excessive mechanical voids in residential buildings and provide recommendations, which is what we're here today to do. So, just to give some context of what we would see in a typical tower, DCP conducted a citywide analysis of recent construction to better understand the actual mechanical needs of residential buildings, to understand what is excessive mechanical space and where and when excessive mechanical space is being used in the city. So a typical tower, as we see here today, might have mechanical space on a lower level, perhaps separating a non-residential use, commercial use maybe, to the residential use of the tower, would have a mechanical bulkhead, and for taller towers might also include mechanical space within the tower itself. city planning's proposal, sorry, I don't know about it. Oh. Put it once, here we go. So city planning's proposal would address excessively large contiguous or clustered voids. So by contiguous voids, we mean, if there's one mechanical floor, but it's excessively large in height. Or clustered voids, where we would see maybe 4 separate floors, but they're clustered together in a way that you wouldn't see in a typical tower, and it reaches the same effect of a contiguous void. So we're hoping to address these issues in residential districts with the goal of limiting the use of artificially tall residential mechanical voids and encouraging residential buildings that activate and engage with their surroundings. We need to balance these goals with recognizing the need for reasonably sized and distributed mechanical spaces in residential buildings and continue to support flexibility in the pursuit of design excellence. So to accomplish these goals, the proposed text amendment will do the following. The basic rule of the text amendment will be to modify tower floor area provisions to count mechanical voids that exceed the height of 25 feet as zoning floor area. So as I mentioned before, typically right now, mechanical floors do not count for zoning floor area. Now, if you have a floor that is larger than 25 feet, that will count for zoning floor area. To calculate how much zoning floor area, we would measure the height of the space. So in this example, this is measured 125 feet. We'll divide that by assumed 25-foot floor to floor is what you'd see as an appropriate mechanical space, and then that results in 5 floors. So, and in this example, this building would have 5 floors of zoning floor area added to the overall height and bulk of the building. So hopefully would dissuade people from going that route. Secondly, to avoid clustering, if any mechanical floors are located within 75 feet of each other, they would count as zoning floor area regardless of the height of each floor. So in a scenario where perhaps there's 4 separate floors, each one measuring 20 feet independently, so not tripling that 25-foot height, if they're clustered together and closer than 75 feet, you add them all up, and then the same, we'll divide them by the presumed 25-foot floor to floor, and then this would result in this scenario, 3 zoning floor area. Does that make sense so far on the basic rules? I want to keep going.
Wait till,
Yeah, let's wait till the end.
Unless
Thanks.
saw some maybe confused faces, but okay. So these are the 2 basic rules: the max 25-foot height and no more than 75 feet in distance from one another. In mixed-use buildings, the rules are sometimes applied a little differently. So for mixed-use buildings that are predominantly residential, if it's at least 75% residential, the rules apply to the entire building. So for example, you have ground floor Dwayne Reed, maybe a more mechanical space for that Dwayne Reed, the entire building still fits within these provisions. But if we have a mixed-use building that is not predominantly residential, or is more than 25% non-residential, then this rule would only apply to the residential portion of the building. Mechanical needs for non-residential uses vary quite a bit. It's really hard for us to, at this point, predict what the needs would be for a hotel, say, compared to a medical school, in this example. So they don't apply to that portion of the building. So in this scenario, this is Mount Sinai Medical School and Residential Tower. The medical school portion of the tower makes up more than 25% of the overall building. So this portion of the building, the school and the mechanical uses that are for the school, are not subject to the rule, but the upper portion, the residential tower on top, is. Okay. So in summary, modify residential tower floor area provision to account mechanical voids that are taller than 25 feet as zoning floor area. Mechanical voids located within 75 feet of each other also count as zoning floor area. and non-residential mechanical spaces in mixed-use buildings are subject to the same 25-foot, 75-foot rule if non-residential uses occupy less than 25% of the overall building. Now, where these regulations apply. So after a citywide study, we have determined that right now, these amendments are applying to residential tower developments located within non-contextual R10 and R9 districts and their equivalent commercial districts. Special districts that rely on the underlying FAR and tower height regulations, so this would be the Lincoln Square district or the Union Square district. And the proposal would also include portions of special districts that impose special tower regulations, such as the Special Clinton and West Chelsea district. So zooming in on Community Board 1, we can see in Community Board 1 we have some R10 and R9 equivalent, which are highlighted in blue and orange, so the provision applies to these areas. The Tribeca Mixed Use District is not included. It's a special district with contextual rules about bulk and height that we're excluding it from this text amendment. Also, you'll notice that the financial district is excluded. As a central business district, financial district was not incorporated into our initial study. We recognize the FIDI is becoming more and more residential. However, the local context is really unique, and we feel that the issue needs further study within the central business districts. So,
Allison, I'm sorry. Go back down one. On the east side, it almost looks like, on the east side, yeah. That blue patch almost looks like it's in the river. Am I misreading that?
Pier building.
yeah, I think this might be the piers that are
That's
off
what
of
I'm
the
asking.
coast here. I think this is probably the piers, so it's not.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Oh, Basketball City, right?
Basketball City.
I don't know. Yeah, this might not be following the exact shape of the
Thank you.
pier line. You're correct. Yeah. Okay. So moving forward from today, as I mentioned before, this referral period ends March 8th. The CPC vote is to be announced. As I mentioned, we're still looking into this issue of how this might apply to central business districts. So we're working on the phase 2 of the research of this, where we will focus on how this might apply to central business districts, including FIDI, including Midtown. And DCP is going to issue recommendations in summer of 2019, this summer. That's everything.
All right, before we get started, so what we're going to do is we're going to have our round of questions from the committee, and then I'm going to ask Councilmember Ben Kalos to come up. These items 3 or 4 on our agenda, but it doesn't make sense for us to vote on a resolution. He's here to present a view, and so we'll want to hear that. But questions just for Allison at this point? Okay, we'll start with
Oh,
Councilman.
so sorry.
The Seaport Historic
Or Michael,
District,
either one.
does
Go.
that, is not going to be covered by this? Because there are special rules for height limits.
Yeah, the Seaport Historic District is either, I think it would be a contextual district that has its own height limit, right? There's a 120-foot height limit for
Right.
buildings there. So it doesn't really make sense for someone to install an excessive mechanical void in that space, knowing that there's a height cap. Because when we've seen this being used, it's, they're installing a mechanical space that these residential units at the top kind of are taller than everything, you get a better view, but if there's a height cap, then you're not really gaining much.
So one of the voids that we looked at was actually taller, I think, than that height limit on that area.
What if, for sustainability, you have to go up another 12 feet or something like that? Is there any impact there?
For oh, you mean you would raise the whole elevation of the
Right.
building? I'd have to double check the text if the height is measured from the design flood elevation or the elevation.
I could
Yeah,
just
Sure.
jump on. Our regulation is not necessarily like, requiring like a mechanical space to be located in a certain location in a building. It's just like a preventing excessively large buildings of mechanical voids. So, if you are in a floodplain, of course you can, always raise your mechanical above the, flood elevation. And we believe that 25 feet allowance would accommodate all mechanical needs for that building.
Colin, you had a question?
Two contradictory and quick ones. Is there any legitimate reason for these guys to have something more than 25 feet for mechanical areas? And if so, is there an appellate process?
Sorry, a what process?
An appellate process?
There's no special permit or waiver currently built into the action.
I know nothing about construction, but if someone needed 76 feet, could they apply for a waiver or something, I guess is my question.
They would have to count some part of the area as floor area, because there's no waiver to get out of it if this proceeds in this fashion.
So it's not stopping you from having larger
Right.
areas, it's just that means it counts towards your overall floor area
Got it.
calculation.
And the second one, why are you limiting it to why can't it be applied to downtown, further downtown?
Financial district.
Yeah, so the financial district is, was just saying, we're currently embarking on a further study on how this should be applied to central business districts. They're just a little bit more unique in context than the residential areas. A lot of the buildings are mixed use, and as I mentioned, mixed use is a little difficult in the, depending on the use, they could have drastically different mechanical needs.
Okay.
And this isn't just, it's not just FIDI, but it's also the Central Business District of Midtown.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
We were originally tasked with looking at residential towers, because
Yeah.
that's where the issue was. So when we zoned in on that, pun intended, and we looked at hundreds of buildings, and we saw a consistency in the way these residential towers were being built. We were then asked about the commercial, and that brings in a whole other area that's more, less straightforward. There's less consistency in the design of the buildings, depending on what type of commercial use. If it's a hospital, they might have more mechanical needs. If it's other uses, they might have less. So that's what we're looking at now and trying to determine how to best move forward with those.
But all the tall buildings going up now in financial center are residential. And that's probably been the biggest growth that we've had is downtown, especially in the financial district. And these overgrown towers is what's starting our skyline right now.
Yeah.
So I think there's more growth down here than any other place, including Midtown, for residential.
Yeah, I mean, we recognize that the financial district is becoming more residential and the growth is residential. It's just that we feel that we need to study the issue further and look at the context in the central business district before applying the regulation as is to the.
And this isn't related to building height. This isn't related to mechanical voids. The issue is the void in the building that doesn't need to be there. This doesn't regulate building height.
Paul, did you have a question?
Just following up on what everyone else is saying. Most of the buildings are either mixed use or residential, as was said. But you gave examples of buildings that you're dealing with that have different uses in them. So why couldn't you just apply those same sorts of standards down here rather than restudy the thing? And how long will this restudy process take?
Yes, so thank you for your question. Those central business districts are like a predominantly built out, and they built out with high lot coverage, no residential buildings, often with no side yard or rear yard. So the built context is significantly different from the upper east, west side residential context, and we want to make sure. And on top of that, special district has special height and setback regulation. We just had what happens to historic district. They have their own height regulations, and Lower Manhattan has its own special floor area ratio plaza and all the other regulation that is not typical in other part of the city. So we are further investigating in how we can possibly address abuse of mechanical voids if such thing happens in those areas.
In the time frame?
as on previous said, we are committed to announce,
This
our
summer.
proposal by summer of this year.
Thank you.
Alice and Tammy?
So I think it's fantastic, high time that someone has looked into this unbelievably egregious loophole in zoning. But a lot of people have criticized Department of State Planning just a little for not going far enough. And one of the things that's pointed out is that, after the 75 feet, could we expect that at 76 feet, you could have another 25-foot mechanical and keep going, and that this wouldn't count? So is there something that's been considered, or why is that sort of not something that the Department of City Planning is looking at in terms of a way to control the height of these buildings? Like, why wouldn't there be some sort of cap, I know has been called for, in terms of having these mechanical voids actually have a level of reasonableness that they in fact equate to what the what the mechanicals in the building are required to be. In other words, why should there be all this excess at all? Why couldn't there be some sort of description as to identifying that the space has to be commensurate with the mechanicals in the building? Those two questions.
So I think really the intention of this is to create predictability. Like I mentioned at the very beginning, this example you said of after 25 feet, there's another 25 feet.
Right.
That's not out of character of what you might see in a very, very tall building that you would need. You would need mechanical space interspersed within, but we feel that these distances and height limits of the mechanical space is in keeping with like an appropriate amount. Does that make sense?
Well, it makes sense. I'm not sure I agree with it, but it makes sense. And,
I-
and
Do you, sorry, do you
Sure,
want to add anything?
yes, like if I may, yes, so we very carefully looked into what buildings are actually doing, and our conclusion is that evenly spaced distributed mechanical space do improve the need, efficiency of those mechanical needs for the building, and if you have a pipe that is 200 feet long, it takes time and energy to bring that hot water down to the unit that is actually serving, and by saying the distribution have to be much bigger, then we require all those mechanical supply to be located farther and farther away from serving floor space. So and we had one example that city sponsored almost 100% affordable development in East Harlem that had mechanical space every 9 stories, and that was needed because the building height, and they needed 2 additional mechanical space in the middle of the building, and that happened to be very close to 75 feet we are proposing here.
why wouldn't text saying that you have to identify the mechanical space needed in the building, wherever it might be, is be part of this whole campaign to control the size of these voids? Mechanicals in a building are what they need to be, and so this sort of additional set of, endless potential spaces seems like something that could be controlled in the way this is written.
Sure.
Is it something that they're considering looking at more, or not?
Sure, we are definitely reviewing all kinds of comments, and yes, we did hear that comments coming back more quite often, and but at the same time we also hear the other side, just as we heard in this room, 75 feet 25, is that is it gonna are we sure we are not gonna impede any legitimate mechanical space that need a higher height or more closer spacing? So we just have to have balanced approach, and as far as we saw hundreds of buildings we reviewed, there was no occurrence if you have 1,000 feet tall buildings, we don't necessarily see mechanical space every 7 floors, but for medium-sized height buildings, because of the tower height that is not as high, they just needed to have additional spaces kind of closer to 75 feet we are proposing today.
Okay, one last question, which is just the size of the difference between when there are no walls, when it's not enclosed mechanical space. What, could you just go over that?
Sure, yes. So, our proposal is addressing, enclosed mechanical
Right.
voids or, other enclosed space that is not, accessible. Our proposal doesn't go to, open air, space that
But we
is.
see that very often, so how is Department of City Planning regarding that, these very large open space areas that are,
Sure.
again,
45
adding,
Broad, for example.
sorry?
45 Broad, for example, in our own
Exactly.
community district.
Right.
Thank you for pointing it out. I'm not personally familiar with the building, you referred to, but we have seen a number of, existing buildings. We often come to, City Corp building example in Midtown, which has, a pretty tall, space under stilts, which has very nice plaza under it, and everybody, it's landmarked, and we really, want to make sure that we don't prevent that kind of design feature going forward. We see a material difference between enclosed unusable space that is not contributing to the the quality of the city life, except for the sole purpose of raising residential floor higher up for higher value. Open air space in between buildings do have different purposes, and it will take some additional study to figure out how we can address it.
Tammy, and then Anthony's got a question.
So the timeline that you show here is really only the timeline for R9 and R10 and equivalent.
Yeah.
When we're asking about studying for FIDI, for example, there is no timeline set up for those yet, if I understand that correctly.
I'm sorry?
No, that's correct. So the
This
referral period for
ends.
this text amendment is referring to these districts
Right,
only.
correct.
We are committed to a study and issuing recommendations for the central business districts this summer. So for the purpose of the resolution today, it's in regards to the amendments in front of you.
Oh, okay.
Right, but the
I think-
research will start summer of 2019?
No, we are committed to roll out or make a announcement
We're doing
on
it
what
now,
we
we're
would
doing the
do.
research now.
I think the concern is a lot of these buildings will be built by that point. And this
Or
building phase will
plans
be over by then.
Plans filed.
Well, we thought it was important to get this one out, because it was ready to go, and.
So will there be purview and overview on buildings that are currently in the areas that are being studied, for example, FIDI, for this type of construction abuse, for lack of a better expression for it?
I think it would depend on if this is approved prior to specific buildings being filed, right?
If they've already got their building permits, and they're 100% truthful on their building permits, then it could prove more difficult. But as we've seen from some of these buildings that have voids in them, they file an as-of-right plan, which means they don't have to get approvals about anything, and then they'll come back later with a different plan, they'll file a new plan, which, what they're really wanting to do. So,
We've seen that too many times now.
Anthony?
Yeah, I'm sorry if I missed it. What's the penalty for violating this? They don't get a building permit, or?
No, so the floor area. So if you build a 125-foot mechanical space, you can have it if you want, but then you have 5 extra floors counted towards your overall zoning floor area. So it doesn't really
and
benefit
that
you.
would then be taken off, presumably the top of the building, which has the most demand from the highest price per square foot.
So it would then bring that height down?
Very much, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just wanted to understand, thank you.
Yeah.
Right.
Other questions? Councilmember Kalos, please.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back at Community Board. One, thank you to DCP for the proposal. I may want to pull things from the proposal, particularly the one that had the distribution of the voids. Perfect. Councilor Ben Kalis, I want to thank you for hearing this item. I want to thank the board members here. I've seen a bunch of you at Borough Board. So, anyone here a fan of 432 Park? Anyone here have a problem with 432 Park? So I don't like it, and I think most people have not liked it. So when I got elected, we started putting funding, member item funding from my office, towards groups like Friends of the Upper East Side Historic District to figure out exactly what went wrong with 432 Park. And what you'll find in this one pager is it's actually 25% empty. And that's why you can actually see through the building. And we started putting things together, and we sat down with city planning and an urban planner. Does CB1 have urban planners? I think you're one of the you're going to have your work cut out for you over the next couple of months. Good. We have more for you. And so we showed them, it's on this face, this is the new Vignoli building. 432 was the first one, but basically it's a barbell. It has 10 stories, or however many stories, and then 150 feet, and then what have you. It's like the Jetsons, but in the Jetsons, like, it was cool, and it looks more like Blade Runner in real life. And so the goal is to actually try to fix for this. Ultimately, according to Gothamist, we've learned that they're actually pulling the sides of the building off, which is why your question about enclosed versus unenclosed is very on point and very frustrating. Because, just so you know, I'm a tech entrepreneur. The balance is always going to be between innovation and regulation. So I have no illusion that no matter what we do, real estate will innovate because there's billions at stake, and that's how it works. That's how democracy and capitalism work. Ultimately, CB8 wants to do a straight-up height cap. I would love to have one if DCP would give it to us. But what they will do is work with us along trying to close loopholes. And that being said, we worked very closely with Borough President Gail Brewer. I'm really grateful that she's hosting us here. We also have a coalition with Landmarks West, and we're now citywide in terms of trying to close loopholes. This was the beginning. We've asked them to come back. We're very grateful that they will come back on the commercial piece. One piece is, they handed me the map. Do you folks have the map, or is it just the... Yeah. You have their map, so there's their map. Can I pull that for... So here, this map scares me because I looked at it and I was like, oh my God, all that white place is going to be mechanical voids, and so I made a different map. I learned Carto. It's really cool. So it's close. You can go online and poke at it. It's at benkalis.com/voids. So a lot of your district is actually protected by the R1 through R8, which has the sky exposure plane, or height protected. There's places where my map is not quite as accurate as theirs is. So please don't hold me 100% to it. I am not an urban planner. I can give you my Carto account if you want to fix it up. Particularly the yellow area above your district isn't quite all at risk, but the rest of it should be. So we have the sky exposure plane. Even though it's not going to necessarily apply to the building on the Upper East Side, I'm still supporting it. Friends is still supporting it. Landmarks is still supporting it. All of us are still supporting it because it's when somebody does what you want, you make the order at the restaurant, and if they get it close enough, you take it, and if it isn't, sometimes you send it back. We didn't feel it was enough to send it back. I came out to ask you for a resolution in support. As I know from being on a community board, nothing is ever completely 100% in support. It is always usually with support with specific recommendations for ways to improve. I'm also asking that you immediately start thinking about what should city planning come back with in terms of for the commercial area. One thing I'll just note on the 75-foot height, which you brought up, and I hadn't done the numbers till you brought up, but let's say we have a bad developer. If they do the 75 feet, then it's 75 feet plus 24 mechanical plus 25 feet plus 24 mechanical, which still gets you to a 25% empty building. And ultimately, I don't necessarily think that is the best. So you may want to consider something like saying maybe that number should be 100. If you did it 100 feet plus every 24 feet, then it comes out to 20% empty. If you said that they could only do mechanicals every 125 feet, and then they do 24 feet, that comes out to 155 feet, and that would get you to a 15% empty building. But I would just suggest that that is, I got the idea because of you, and I'm glad that I came. So that's why I'm here, ultimately suggesting that unenclosed be included, that stilts should be included. And then in terms of the difference between 53rd and this, I love 53rd and Lexington, and that I believe it's Citibank, or who's Citicorp. And so I think the big difference for me there is you have the buildings actually kind of meet each other, so it's not like completely on stilts. There's a commercial space, there's a public space, there's a public plaza, there's a church and senior center, there's an enhanced subway entrance, and in all of this, we're just talking about an excessive mechanical space. So I've gone on too long. I'm asking folks, because otherwise Wilfredo will yell at me, to sign our petition at benkalos.com/voids. At CB11, DCP had suggested this might be on the agenda for March 13th for city planning for a public hearing. I will amend my handout based on the feedback that it is not necessarily guaranteed for March 13th.
Yeah, I don't know if you.
Fair enough. Okay, so we will amend that. Any quick questions for me? Thank you very much.
Thanks for helping
Can I
out.
ask you how the
Thank you.
scaffolding legislation is going?
So,
Scaffolding legislation, a little off topic, but
so
while we have you here. since
we
you
introduced a
came present-
second bill on scaffolding because the scaffolding is literally falling on people, especially on windy days. I'm petrified to walk through this city. The reason the scaffolding is falling in part is because they're allowed to self-certify. So we've introduced legislation that says within 6 months they have to be inspected, and then every 6 months thereafter. The scaffolding that failed in Soho was actually 6 months old. So we're hoping that will do it, plus the fees. That being said, we have the legislation. The issue we've run into is what's the bad stuff that gets somebody to take down the scaffolding, even if, how do we force somebody to repair a building? And so that's where we've been jammed up. That is where I would look to the collective knowledge of those here in this room. People have better ideas than I. We've worked with New York Hospitality Alliance, who says we should have a private right of action so we don't have to pay rent. They represent large chains who can sue a large landlord and say we don't want to pay. New York State Restaurant Association says we can't afford to bring those lawsuits. We need a different private right of action. So we haven't been able to find common ground amongst advocates. And then ultimately we're just trying to figure out if anyone has any specific idea on how to get it done. So I'm open to it, because ultimately what I've been told by DOB is we can't just say take down the scaffolding even if it's still dangerous.
Okay, thanks.
Great,
Appreciate it.
thank you. Good
Thank you,
job.
you got it.
And I should point out, Councilmember Kalis came to our Quality of Life Committee about a year or so ago
Yeah.
to present, and was gracious with his time. So that's the reason I followed up on that question on
Thank
behalf
you.
of the Quality of Life Committee. Thank you, Councilmember.
You got it.
All right, it's our turn to debate. So what do we want to do here, folks?
I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that this is something that is good for the city.
Yeah.
I wish that they were rolling it into FIDI yesterday. So, I mean, I think that has to be one of those, therefore be it resolved, please move quickly forward to include Lower Manhattan.
Forthwith. Right.
Forthwith. But I do also agree with Alice and with Councilmember Kellis. If it is an unenclosed mechanical area, it still should count. If it's mechanical area, it's a mechanical area. So whether you have windows around the outside or four walls, or you leave it open because you find the technology to do that, is to still count.
What about
Right.
the point where you, and I don't confess to know the full details of how 45 Broad is set up, but they are going to have some sort of outdoor amenity for the residents of that building in that one of those spaces that they've created. If it has mechanical in it, I get it. They're bumping it up. But
Right, but if it's something that that's gonna have public access, then that counts towards their FAR anyway, because that's a publicly accessible floor. So I'm not, if they're trying to, say, oh, only this part is publicly accessible, therefore the 40 feet above doesn't count, I think that's kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul there.
Alice, you had a view?
I wanted to thank Councilmember Kalis of what he left, but it's a tremendous piece of legislation. It certainly needs some work as far as from my perspective, and that it's not quite there. And I think the council members pointing that out. So I would say that in the resolution, we should identify the things that were discussed today as possible things to research or go forward on with the Department of City Planning. I'm sure it's not, obviously it's not a done deal. And I think the ones that are being pointed out, so the exterior skin, what's happening at the stilts, I personally can't be that specific because I haven't even, to be honest, read the text amendment super closely.
Right.
But I think that's an area that needs to be looked at. I think the idea of, the point I feel is helpful is just, what about this question of just having mechanical voids have some relationship specifically to the needs of the mechanical needs of the building? I think that seems like a point worthy of consideration. This idea of, I'm not sure how to word it, where you get away from this idea that at the 26th floor, you get this other potential, at the 76th floor, you have this other potential wedge of space. I don't know how to word that, it's something that, 76 foot, 76 between the next, right. But somehow that seems like a loophole that's going to be used against us. I would like to address that in some way. So those are items that we pointed out, I would try to add into the, as things to further research that need to be considered in a resolution or, in a final text amendment.
So on that last point, Diana's going to come up with some language that we'll put in the draft and center in.
Everybody
Before Crystal Pool. Are there other points that people, it sounds like we're obviously supportive of the legislation with some additional specific asks for this particular text amendment, as well as a policy ask of getting hours together shortly. Yes?
Just to double down on what everyone, I think, agrees on is even stronger language on applying it to FIDI and Seaport and to Fulton. I don't know how you can get stronger, but the strongest possible language to apply it, not forthwith, but
Right.
last month.
Right.
I mean, the building phase is, the trend we're going through right now is going to end sooner rather than later, so it's going to be a pointless thing to bring up anyways at this point.
I have a quick question. Is the Seaport, is that district excluded from this?
It's
Yes.
a contextual district
So-
and it has height limits, so
Okay.
like Allison was saying, it's just not really, it's counterintuitive for developers and
To do this.
counterproductive for them to do it.
Unless a developer comes along and asks for a waiver.
Unless they use
Imagine
corporation.
that.
Well, and what I don't understand pursuant to that is, let's use an example for our own neighborhood, right? You've got you've got air rights over the tin building that are hotly looking to be pursued, to be applied somewhere, right? You've got 250 water, which has a height restriction. So on the assumption that, let's just say in the worst case scenario, right, they get air rights applied, so therefore there's now a new height for that building that's allowable in the contextual zone. You really want something like this because you don't want the air rights purchased of neighboring buildings in order to, even if you get through the approval process, just to push the building up. Because that's really what they're looking for, is to get over for the skyline.
And I think we should deal with that in what I'm presuming is going to be the summertime when they come back to us with the proposal for the downtown area. We can get really granular on that. I think it's a good point. Michael?
I'm concerned about,
She was gonna say something.
Sorry,
I was gonna say
let Allison.
The scenario that you're talking about, that whole process, that would be, several discretionary actions. So I think just keep that in mind, that it's not that as of right, they can just, like the examples that we've been seeing is kind of as of right, these buildings just pop up with these excessive mechanical voids and multiple authorities would be reviewing it.
So when you say that, that means that the community board and/or borough president or council would have to weigh in on that?
Yeah, so I mean that it would go through dealers,
It would go through you.
and it would go through
Okay.
landmarks, because it's a historic district as well. And landmarks would have to think that
So we have
whatever
some
buildings.
I'm concerned about projects that were sort of in the pipeline. Two Bridges is out of our community district, but let's use 80 South Street as the example, where the Chinese bought it. They supposedly are going to build something smaller than the World Trade Center. I have no idea whether the plans have been filed yet or not, but I guess, Allison, what you were saying was if the plans were filed, this wouldn't, and let's assume that you studied FIDI and it was effective for FIDI, it wouldn't apply. And so the whole question of grandfathering in and, whether or not we can stop projects that aren't in the ground yet, because this is the right way of doing it.
Yes, it's not so much whether they're in the ground or whether construction's begun, is if the plans have been filed. I don't know if the plans for that particular building have been filed. I don't believe that that building is an example of excessive void use. I think that it's just an assemblage of FAR. So again, this is not to limit height. This is to limit excessive voids. So, you know, whether this would even, whether the timeline of that building, it might be kind of moot in this instance, because I don't know if it actually is utilizing excessive voids to reach a taller height. Does that make sense?
It's one piece of the whole super tall puzzle.
Yeah.
Right, but no grandfathering or anything in yours?
Our proposal is not like, you know, proposing to have any like a special grandfathering provision. It will rely on the underlying rule, which basically says if you're done with the foundation work for the building, you have a permit, building permit for, then that is the moment the building is, you know, grandfathered. So, you know, if a building doesn't even have a permit yet and not working on the foundation, then, you know, the finish of foundation work is, you know, something like, you know, unknown time frame. And, you know, if our tax amendment was adopted before they finished their foundation, then their permit is like, you know, last, like it's not in effect. They have to pursue a new, like, you know, building permit that complies with our new regulation. If they're done with the foundation work before our, you know, tax amendment is adopted, then, you know, that building permit is already vested and our tax will not, you know, catch them.
Yeah, just consider stalled projects in what you're doing here, and how this could be positive to improve stalled projects.
All right, with that, let's call the question on the resolution. The resolution will effectively be in favor with the several asks that we've all talked about here.
Second.
All in favor? Any opposed? I'm sorry, took away your line.
Any opposed? Abstaining? Recused? It's unanimous. Motion carries.
All right,
Good job, thank you.
thanks, Hans. We're going to move on. We're up to item 4 on our agenda. This is a continuing discussion on the borough-based jail system and specifically the MDC, the Manhattan Detention Center complex, now proposed for 124, 125 White Street. We're going to welcome the Mayor's Community Affairs Unit and the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. I know I saw Gabby around earlier and Dana is here as well.
Over here.
There she is. Okay. And the rest of the team as well. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having us again. I think I'll let the presentation load, but we have a lot of city representatives here, so we'll start by introducing ourselves. As you know, I'm Gabby Danowell from the Mayor's Community Affairs Unit.
Dana Kaplan with the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. Hello again.
I'm Matthew Sneathan with Perkins Eastman Architects.
And I'm Catherine Kramer with Perkins Eastman as well.
And we have a couple of representatives from DCP and DDC to help address questions after the presentation on more of the design, construction, and zoning related to the project. Before we get started, Anthony, I know it's not a point of interest with the conversations that have been happening at the Neighborhood Advisory Committee, so I don't know why we wait. If Anthony, you want to chime in, give me a recap.
I'll try and be as accurate and objective as possible. The Community Affairs Office through under the Mayor's administration has initiated what's called a Neighborhood Advisory Council. And the composition of it is predominantly local residents, some nonprofits, a couple of other organizations, and in our case, both CB1 and CB3. Diana has attended them with me. The proposal is to have 4 meetings of the NAC. We've had 2 so far. 2 more are planned in end of February, beginning of March. The purpose of the NAC is to try and get, I'm told, as much input as possible. I'm just on these news. And that is by hearing what the community has, because this is a major impact, at least in our community. Now, we're partnering with CB3 because even though ULURP will take place at this board and through this committee, it borders directly CB3, and clearly the community that will be impacted the most is the Chinatown community. And so there is a strong representation there. But I will have to say, and I see some other members of the NAC here with me, that everyone has their thoughts on how this should happen. Some will say, I don't want it to happen. Some will say, it should happen. I would, by the way, take a note, there is the Lipman report that started all this, that essentially said Rikers Island is a problem that cannot be fixed and has to be addressed. And so the purpose, or the thing that we have to work on is, assuming that is the case, how best to address that. And there are a variety of opinions. And the NAC is an attempt to bring all of those voices together. Now, I don't know that it will come up with consensus, and that's why this board, along with CB3 and our neighbors in Chinatown, will have to craft how we view this, this development. And it will be a major impact. If any of you have walked around Chinatown, Baxter Street or Center Street, you know the nature and the character of that neighborhood. Now imagine removing 2 towers and putting up another 1.5 million square feet. That's a major impact that will take years and have a real effect on that community. And so it's a very sensitive issue and a complex issue. I don't know that there's any one answer. There's a lot of things to consider. So the NAC hopefully will funnel lots of the community input into this, this process, along with ULURP. I want to make sure that we're all clear that ULURP is one of the mandated responsibilities in the city charter of the community board and of our elected officials and of everyone that have a voice in how this process of managing city property is handled. So tonight is one of the first steps to hear your voices and also educate you on what the implications are and what the plans are. And those plans often are evolving. And so that will often cause people to stop and question things. You know that we had the example of, first there was White Street, then there was 80 Center Street, now we're back to White Street again. So there's a little bit of confusion perhaps and questioning as to how are decisions being made. And so it's important to ask all the questions that you might have. I hope that helps. I'll shut up before I put another foot in my mouth.
No, thank you, that's really fair. And so on that note, we'd like to present to you tonight, as we committed to monthly updates, the same information that was presented at that meeting. So tonight we have a lot more information on the design, the building and the program of the Manhattan site. And then I think it makes sense if I do an NAC recap within that context of what information people were discussing. So on that note.
And I'm going to turn it, so Matthew from Perkins Eastman will walk us through both the updated information in terms what is the proposed program at the site, and then also what is contemplated in terms of what will be within the facility itself. And then I will talk about, I know obviously the big question that a lot of people have is the proposed scale of the building and the maximum height right now, and you know what the city has said, which is that we are committed to reducing that maximum height. So I'll give a little update on what that looks like.
Do you want to go through this and then take questions?
I think so. It's not yes, that would probably be helpful. There's not a ton of slides, so I think we can get through just making sure that we provide the best updated information and then open up to questions. And again, as was said in the beginning, we have other colleagues as well to be able to speak to a number of issues. You want to do that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all and good evening. So as was earlier described, the site of this project is now 124-125 White Street. So the current site of Manhattan Detention South and Manhattan Detention North. The Manhattan Detention South site does share the lot with 100 Center Street, where the New York County Court, which has the Supreme and Criminal Divisions, and the other Supreme Court is directly across the street. Our ground floor plane here is, has a significant amount of community usage, which I'll get back to in a moment here. Community being retail or community-facing elements, and trying to align to the maintained White Street. Baxter Center. We have a Sallyport component here, which is feeding the court, and a substantial amount of the public space of the court or of the jail facility itself. Currently, the program of the building is 930,000 gross square feet of housing, 430,000 square feet of support, 20,000 square feet of community facilities, which could be retail as well, 1,510 beds, up to 100 parking spaces, and a maximum allowable height of 495 feet. Whoops, sorry, that jumped. The tower is broken into essentially the support spaces, which is the lower podium, which is the building support, mechanical, some of the detainee services, the community spaces, the visiting components, public lobbies, etc. And then the tower is the housing component. So we'll go into the kind of specifics of each one of those. In reality, the basic context of all of this is really we're trying to focus on better reentry for the detainees back into the communities. So our visiting space is placed low within the podium. It's intended to be large, certainly large enough that we are not, queuing individuals on the street. We have large public lobbies, more attuned screening areas to bring everybody up to a larger visitation space to try to reconnect the detainees with their families. So this is a rendering of, active children's spaces, so they can engage to their children, and then, more brightly lit and off the floor level, so we can actually have some window areas that would address that. We have detainee services also here in the podium. Those would be food services, laundry. We have an on-site clinic that can manage some smaller issues, just to make sure that we're maintaining the health of the detainees. The intake and release procedures for when the detainee is coming into the system themselves and check for their mental health, check for their basic physical health, and determine what the programs and services are best utilized for them. We have ground floor community spaces, which is fronted on Baxter and Center and down White Street. Again, this can be retail, this can be community-oriented. In any way, it's community-facing and not jail-oriented in any significance. We do have the lower-level mechanical and the top-level mechanical. We do not have large amounts of interstitial mechanical. And we cannot exceed 25 feet. Actually, it is a pressure on the building to have two very small mechanicals trying to feed this entire tower. Is simply because also we are looking at a lot of emergency generator systems and backup power, fuel storage, etc., to manage some of the more extreme situations that the facility can get under. Looking into the housing units themselves, so this is our typical housing unit arrangement. We are looking at smaller housing units than what has been predominantly done by the Department of Corrections to date. So currently the department is running housing units that are around the 50 detainees per housing unit. We're reducing that significantly. In addition to the smaller housing units, we're trying to, by and large, bring the programs and services to the detainee. So within the housing unit themselves, where they have free range of motion, we can have service providers providing classes and support and brought to the detainee, smaller interview rooms, direct access to the outdoor recreation, and then immediately adjacent to this we have other shared support spaces with some of the adjacent housing units. So we're trying not to move the detainee up and down the tower. We're trying to bring all of the services by and large to the detainee. Limiting movement should help us increase the amount of safety. So we have a general population of about 40%. We have dedicated units towards what is called therapeutic. That could be mental health support, that could be substance abuse support, that could be a variety of increased, enhanced programming for the detainee to, again, improve their outcomes. We have about 11%, which is admissions, your first introduction to the Department of Corrections. When you are brought in, you are housed in admissions housing, which is really dedicated to those services. We have a female population of approximately 7%, and then our special population, which is our highest classification, and some of our 18-year-olds as well, which also we're in much smaller housing units. All of our housing units are currently designed to have direct light to the outside, so every cell has a window, plus the large direct sunlight into the day room themselves.
So, and I will do this one, which is just that obviously, you know, there's been an appropriate level of questions just about whether the scale of this proposed facility at 495 feet is, you know, out of scale with the neighborhood. And that is, or just, you know, larger than we would want. And that is definitely something that the city is very committed to looking at and to working on. And, you know, we are kind of going in, this program was developed, and I think a lot of people have heard this in the past, but this program was developed with a lot of engagement with different justice advocates and service providers and focus groups with formerly incarcerated individuals, and really trying to think about, you know, how can these facilities be, you know, something that is a markedly different experience and better than what we currently have, and how can these be conduits of culture change. It is not about, you know, facilities themselves, but a lot of the types of culture change initiatives that the city has provided, you know, committed to, are obviously better able to be achieved in places that have things like more programming space, more recreation, all of that. The key question that we are really focused on right now is how can we reduce the size and scale of these facilities while not losing the fundamental commitment to making sure that the actual programming of these are better for people who are in detention. You know, I'll just say that these are a range of the types of things that the city is looking at right now. I'll say part of the, I'll walk through them if you can't see closely. You know, part of the process that we are engaged in is, again, more focus groups, more conversations. You know, now that we have the program developed, we're beginning a process of going back to some of the service providers and organizations that provided input into the program to begin with, to say, you know, what are the modifications that could be made, and, you know, what would the impact be for individuals. We've also worked on putting together a peer review that had some national correctional experts to, you know, both pressure test the program and, again, think through, are there ways that we could be thinking about this even better, and again, kind of marrying both the justice concerns and commitment to this, with also recognizing that it's very important for these to, you know, not be something that has a negative impact on the neighborhood and the residents. And I'll say that there's just a couple of kind of the two major categories of things that would reduce the, you know, reduce the scale of the building overall is, one, both reducing the number of beds and reducing the number of people that are in detention, and then two, actually making modifications to the program itself. And so that's basically essentially what you know, see are kind of the two buckets that these things fall under. Some of the things that we are looking at that would reduce the number of beds, so the number of, you know, housing units themselves or floors that provide that housing, are things such as reducing the inefficiency rate. So for instance, right now, we are planning for a need for about 20% swing space. On a national level, we've heard, or you know, from our research and talks with, you know, people around the country, that there's about a 10 to 20% inefficiency factor in terms of allowing sufficient space within a facility so that you can do things such as separate men from women, pretrial from sentence, to address security classifications. So right now we're planning for a 20% inefficiency rate. So, you know, to house 5,000 individuals citywide. That's why we're proposing 6,000 beds. We're looking at, you know, could we actually design and develop these facilities at a smaller inefficiency rate? So is that, can it be closer to, you know, 10% or something in that regard? So that's an open question. Obviously, what we don't want to do is have issues of overcrowding, or, you know, have anything that would negatively impact the experience for people in detention or staff. We're also looking at whether there is a subpopulation of people who have particularly complex mental health, behavioral health, substance abuse, and or medical issues that would be more appropriately housed outside of a detention facility altogether. So are there more hospital-oriented or therapeutic sites that could house some population of the therapeutic units? So that is something that is under consideration. State technical parole violators, that is a population, I will say right now, there are about 700 people who are on Rikers Island, who are just under 700 that are in there for just a violation of their parole conditions, not the commission, not a new crime. First and foremost, we support state legislative reform on parole reform to reduce that number across the board. Those are not people who we believe should by and large be in detention. For a smaller number who, absent or following state legislative change are, in detention, those could also be people who could be housed in other local state facilities. The other things that we're looking at is one, the centralization of women. This is something that could happen within one of the existing sites. I think that we've shared this in the past, but when we first began the process of considering, is it more appropriate in a borough-based jail system to house women that were based off of, in a decentralized model, or in, closer to the courts, closer to their, borough of residence, or within each of the 4 proposed facility, was that the better path, or is it more appropriate to house all of the women together in one location? We did a number of, did a lot of, obviously, examination of what kind of best practices were, and did a lot of focus groups and conversations with women's service providers on that topic, and had been proposing, and are currently proposing, a decentralized model, really with the thinking that if part of the benefit of closing Rikers is to have people closer to the courts, and to have people closer to their boroughs of residence, we didn't want to lose that benefit for the female population. We have heard a lot of feedback from different women's organizations, from some formerly incarcerated women and women's service providers, that there is a concern about whether, especially when we're talking about such a small number of women citywide and such a small number of women within each proposed borough facility, that there could be just a lack of the level of gender-responsive programs and services that we would want, and there could be an unintended consequence of leaving women in those facilities more vulnerable. And so we are looking very intensely at whether in fact we should be looking at a more centralized model, and we've been doing focus groups at Rosie's, which is the women's facility right now on Rikers Island, to talk to the women in detention, both pretrial and sentenced, have been talking to facility staff, have a questionnaire that we've sent to different women's service providers, and are really just trying to make this decision as deliberately as possible. I will say that there is some efficiency that could be gained, and some impact that would have on height and density of the building, just because in a centralized location, it would just be a more efficient configuration, essentially. And then there's other things that we are looking at that would be changes and modifications to the program itself, which would also have an impact on height and density. And those are things such as, whether we could increase the size of a typical housing unit, nowhere near, what we're talking about in terms of what currently exists, but is it possible to have some housing units that are larger than the 32 or 24 18-bed housing units that are currently part of the proposal? An additional housing unit per floor. We've looked at what the impact would be of removing community space, and are really engaged at, trying to think through, again, across the board, what the modifications are that could be done that would bring down the scale and the height of this facility, or these proposed facilities, without negatively compromising program. And it's just an estimate of what the potential height change or FAR change would be. Obviously, we would be pursuing, some number of them, and as we continue to make decisions on this, we'll be able to report back as to what we anticipate the actual facility size would be. And again, are happy to answer questions that people might have as to how that would impact the program in any way. Manhattan zoning, guidance back to you.
No, I think those are just for the Q&A. I think I'll take this time to recap some of what has been discussed at the Neighborhood Advisory Committee, as both Anthony and Diana requested for this meeting. As they've seen, honestly, the goal of these meetings is to come up with a list of recommendations, and I'm sure as you experienced tonight, we've been sharing a lot of information, so the majority, or all of our time has been spent on Q&A on the technical details of this project. You can feel free to jump in or correct me, but the majority of the first meeting was spent on questions about the ULURP process in general and the secret process and what the draft environmental impact statement would analyze and what people should expect through this process. I would say that a helpful suggestion from that first meeting, which we're acting upon, is engaging the impacted businesses around the proposed facility, and our office, along with Councilmember Chin's office, is going to be door knocking and surveying the businesses not only along Baxter Street but on Canal Street to talk to them more about the site and their main concerns. I would say just a couple more issues of note that were brought up. You know, people asked why this particular application couldn't be separated from the other 3 sites, meaning the other 3 boroughs, and we discussed at length how this process is part of a larger plan to reform the criminal justice system and close Rikers overall. So separating the site out would not allow us to achieve that goal. And I would say that just one issue that people brought up, which I think would be important to note here, is people had concerns about, in terms of emergencies, how in the current facility and the proposed facility people would be able to evacuate, and we'd say we follow up on that information from DFC, and that there's no reason to believe that the way that that's handled now would change drastically with the new site. So we have some slides that, not to talk through, but just to use as a tool to explain more of the zoning, which was asked for as part of the first 2 meetings.
Let's do this. So, thank you guys for that presentation. Let's ask members of the committee to pose their questions first, and we'll kind of get through that information. And then there's a couple of members of the public who want to speak, who want to ask some questions as well. But so starting with the committee questions, and I'll lead us off because, Gabby, it's just touching on something you said kind of there at the end. I was the impression that the ULURP for MDC is going to be separated out from the other, 3 site applications, and there won't be one citywide ULURP. Am I hearing something different now, or where do we stand?
The question was whether the Manhattan site could be on a different track, like treated completely differently than the other sites.
Okay,
On
but
a
we're
different timeline, and I'm saying that we explained that it can't be operating on a different timeline.
No,
so there
it's
were,
not separated out. It's still one ULURP application.
okay, that's entirely inconsistent with what we've been told before.
So it's one ULURP application for all 4 sites, but then that it will be considered, the individual community boards or borough presidents will be reviewing the site that is kind of within their jurisdiction. Do you want to?
And certification is still slated for March 29th?
March 25th. We have
March 25th.
DCP here, and
Yeah, I mean, I think that was, there's lots of different actions.
City planning.
So, hey, Frank Michelle, Deputy Director for Zoning, City Planning. The question that you asked, different ULURPs and
Right.
what they mean. So there are different actions that will probably be part of this application, right? Like there'll be a site selection that looks at the needs for facilities across the city. There'll be special permits, right? The needs to actually modify things. Each of those are applicable in different geographies, like a special permit or the city map change that looks at the actual demapping of portions of White Street only exists in White Street, right? It can't be sent out to Queens. So there's sort of different parts. The overall site selection and acquisition will be citywide. Will go to all 4 boroughs, kind of shared. The individual map changes and all of the kind of really specific detailed things that are only applicable in those sites will only be go to those community boards. So it's sort of, it's a frustratingly, it's both answers.
No, I know, but it's inconsistent with what we've been told before, and keying in on specifically on site selection. Initially, we were told it was going to be one citywide ULURP for site selection, and then it was split out, and we were all going to have individual, which is great because each site is very different, and that makes more logical sense, I think. But now we're being told. So when did the decision? When did it go back to one
I think
ULURP?
what they go to all 4 community boards, so I don't think that's.
What is the practical difference for the land?
Yeah, maybe we're missing what you're
What you're
asking.
trying to get at, really. Because you're commenting on the need for a grow-based jail system and the actions that are happening in your district, right?
Well, no. If the site selection application is for all boroughs at once, you're going to have potentially Brooklyn commenting on in dealing with our site selection here in Manhattan and vice versa, right? And I think
I guess I would put it this way, we just did a text amendment that has citywide applicability, and each community board is having their own public hearings, having their own conversations about them. What's the sort of difference that you would see here?
Well,
Just understand.
And just partly the difference too is that we were told more recently that it would be split out, and I think it's just a much better and more efficient process for us to be able to zero in and focus on one site and our site specifically. I don't think it. No, go ahead.
I think one of some of the thinking behind this is that the goal of the program and the need for the program is to close Rikers. So you need all 4 of these facilities to do that. So we're talking about this as a program. There are 4 sites that are part of this program. If one were to approve and the other were not, that we don't achieve our goal. So we need these 4 sites in order to close Rikers Island. Now there are specific actions in each borough, and Brooklyn is not going to be commenting on the closure of White Street, but they are going to be commenting on the closure of Rikers Island at large, which requires all 4 buildings to be built. The specific issues around the building that is being proposed for your neighborhood, we don't anticipate Brooklyn to say we think that it should face south or north, or the emphasis should be in a different direction. But we expect that all the boroughs that have actions in their geography will comment on the closure of Rikers Island as a program and review that.
I'm not certain what the, kind of where the miscommunication, but we did not change the decision about it being one ULURP. So I don't, there wasn't a change, even when we changed the proposed Manhattan site, we had not changed this course of action. And so I certainly, sounds like there's a miscommunication if there was a different understanding of that, but this has been consistent.
Others? Alice? Or
I have to ask one question first.
No.
And I know you were prepared to talk about it. Besides the Europe, we got a communication about remapping White Street. It almost appeared to us as a separate action or activity or comment period. Can you discuss that a little bit more?
Sure. So when that.
A little louder, please.
Sure. Do you mind getting up?
Yeah.
Makes it easier.
I want to stay awake. Thank you.
So when city map changes, so there's a map, so like changes the actual city map, like where streets are and stuff, they go through a slightly longer process than ULURP, right? So you got an application for White Street, and the reason it goes out earlier is because it's sent out to all involved parties, Con Ed, the MTA, the wanting to make sure like what's going on in the street or in that area to make sure there's no concerns. And so that polling letter goes out to a lot of different people besides the community boards. And
I have
so
to interrupt you. That's something new, that term
It's not.
polling. We're not used to that.
I think to be quite honest, it's rare for there to be a mapping action in like Lower Manhattan.
Okay.
Right? Most times you may have it may be like a new street in Staten Island or something like that, and they may be more used to the term.
Okay.
So I think that may be why there may be some sort of like what the heck is this thing? So you get it now. You can comment on the application. But that doesn't change the fact that you also still have the whole process of ULURP to also comment on it along with all the other applications. It's sort of an earlier step given the kind of nature of a map change.
from what I understand conceptually, it's to inform city planning for your certification
That's right.
timeline. So there's this like 30 days now, or some amount of time now, where city planning is collecting information about concerns the community has, so that when they're asked to certify, they have information to certify that matching, that application for matching, so it's like a.
We weren't given the opportunity, if I remember correctly, when they came and talked about the demapping specifically of White Street. We were not given the opportunity to do a resolution or pass comment. That wasn't up for our purview, is what I was told, is what they said. Yeah.
Yeah, but we just, and the reason I'm bringing this up is we just got this maybe Friday.
That's right. You only got it.
Literally, it's brand new to us.
So our 60 days starts now?
No,
This is,
not for the
this is
whole.
before, for map.
For White Street.
That's correct, for map
Because-
changes, this is even before
So
the
that's what
60
I-
days.
December 10th, when they came and presented, they talked about demapping White Street.
Sure.
And there was a lot of conversation. It does not seem like there's been one modification to anything that's happened from what you're presenting since December 10th. Is that true?
Right,
That's,
about the demapping.
About anything, quite frankly. I mean, it's still, it's still 1,500 beds, it's still demapping, it's still 520 feet potentially as a max.
It's 495.
But you had the right to 520 is what they said then.
Yeah, and that was, so that is an update, is that at that point, we were, thought that we would be going in at maximum height 520 and have kind of refined the estimates, and it's 495. So everything else, and that is
25
not.
2 stories.
One less mechanic.
2 stories.
Yeah, sorry, just to clarify, when we were here last month, we were showing you what was to come, but that was not a request for a resolution, that it's still going to be certified at that point.
And the pedestrian public plaza that was promised when those buildings were first built, and that was a community promise, is nowhere within anything that's been said. So that's an original thing that was supposed to have been done as a community amenity and still doesn't exist because it's a placard parking lot. You know, we see lovely things with what looks like parking, but based on the current usage, there's not anywhere near. I mean, how much parking does going from 700 beds to 1,500 beds need? Have you done an analysis on that for community impact or anything like
Well, it
that?
looks like the parking's inside the building.
But how much? You know,
Yes, that's
there's
what-
parking inside the building and then there's parking inside the building. Is that parking for the top 20 officers who are gonna park? Or is that parking for transit and visitors and everything else?
What's the capacity of the parking lot?
Yeah.
100 spaces.
Those analyses will be in the draft EIS and available for comment.
They're saying up to 100,
Up to 100, and then, and to be
But
clear.
how-
recognizing that's not even close to what.
That's not, that's nowhere near.
Yeah, and I think that this is a point that I believe it might have been, maybe you raised at a couple meetings ago, that, you know, obviously we are, you know, that we have heard the neighborhood concerns about parking, that we know that that is a key issue and placard issues. So we are trying to provide as much parking as we can below the site to be able to address some of those neighborhood parking considerations. We acknowledge that, you know, it might not be the need, but, you know, that 100 or up to 100, or, you know, around 100 additional spots that are being provided subgrade, we believe will, you know, help in terms of what that impact is on the neighborhood. And then just to be clear, that then what is contemplated for White Street is that there would no longer be any parking or vehicular access on White Street, but it would be used as a pedestrian thoroughfare or access point, and so it would be open to pedestrian-only traffic, which we have heard is something that was very important and, you know, had been a pre-existing commitment that obviously the, you know, existing cars on that space had impeded.
And I might not be an architect, but my understanding from sitting so long on here, community usage is not retail. Retail is retail. Community usage is community usage. It's almost insulting to call retail community usage. So there's a huge difference between those two, and I would love to hear how community usage, which is usually a give back to the community, is one thing. Retail is retail. I mean,
Yeah, and we have not made a final determination in terms of what that 20,000 square feet of kind of, you know, community use what would be there. That's one of the things that we are seeking input and guidance on, and that's been a topic of discussion in the Neighborhood Advisory Council, and we welcome other suggestions as to what the most appropriate use would be of that space. So it is basically, the part, as Matthew said, that is along Baxter Street and then along White Street, which will be that pedestrian kind of access point or, thoroughfare. And we do not have a plan as to what will be there at this point. We are looking to hear what is, the most appropriate use. We've heard a number of things. Retail is just one option, but not what we would say would be, that it has to be that. And specifically, what we want is something that the neighborhood and community identifies as what is most appropriate.
I have a number of questions that are probably more back in the forest than with the specific trees we're looking at about, the actual surface of community space, which is a terrific question. I'd like to better understand, I've had lots of conversations with lots of people, Legal Fresh and architecture, all sorts of people have lots of opinions on this. This is a huge, huge project. I'd like to understand the urgency of the speed of this. Why do we need to do this so quickly? And, what is the mayor's thinking on that? What is the drive for doing this so quickly? Why can't we look at some of the reforms that are actually in place right now in justice circles, right? Some of the justice reforms and see how these play out, even on Rikers Island. I'm just curious what the urgency, and why not look at the reforms that are just coming into place a little bit more carefully to assess whether this is all worth the kind of cost and hardship this, in some ways, is providing to the city.
Yeah, I want to, I guess, take a step back even from my role as in the mayor's office and just say this kind of call and recognition of the urgency and the importance of closing the jails on Rikers Island is something that I think has been a recognition that was born out of obviously the Lippman Commission, but the work of, 100 different nonprofit and community organizations that kind of signed on and really, I think, made it clear to the mayor's office and to many of us about the importance and the urgency, really, of closing the jails on Rikers Island as quickly as possible. And we don't think that there is a conflict with doing this as quickly as we can, and also being able to achieve the best possible plan. And so we certainly recognize and appreciate that, we are involved in very, very intense engagement and, have been on your agenda for, 3 months now, and we'll be back in March, and, are asking the Manhattan NAC members to, come to many, many meetings. But, we have kind of outlined this is what the maximum envelope is. We have been working for many months on hearing what the community feedback is, and there will be many months more before ULURP is actually certified. And of course, the things that we're going to be looking at then is what are the program modifications to make this the best possible plan, but also, what is passed in Albany this year. There's great excitement that we will, see some real reforms in the criminal justice legislative agenda, which, the mayor and our office is certainly, committed to supporting wholeheartedly. These two things don't have to be in conflict for us to achieve and move forward the plan to close Rikers, and also being able to advance other reform agendas, both on Rikers Island and also in the justice system, as we drive down the number of people who are in jail on a given day from 11,000 when we took office to 9,000 when we announced this plan to, or over 9,000, 9,500 to, less than 8,000 at the end of this year. So I think that we are very committed to executing these reforms at the same time that we're planning for what is a 10-year timeline to close the jails on Rikers Island. So we are working through the public approval process right now, but to do, to get through this approval process, at that point is when we will, issue the RFP for the design, build, construction teams. We are on track for a completion date of 2027. There are many people throughout the city that say 2027 is, too long to close Rikers Island. And so I think that, we are moving as quickly as we can, but want to make certain that we are providing that outlet for community engagement and are able to respond to that. Some of the changes that have been made to date, the things that we're looking at in terms of centralizing women, in terms of, how can we better address, neighborhood concerns around height and density are, you know, the modifications that we are doing right now to make sure that the plan itself is the best it can
And
be.
just to build on a little bit on what Jane is saying, in this city, to build a public building, from the second you think you might want to do it, could be 2 to 4 years before you put a shovel in the ground. So we sort of do have to kind of work concurrently. If we waited until, you know, we knew for certain or we knew more about what reforms might happen, we would then be talking about another 2 to 3 to 4 years before we could put a shovel in the ground. The city's planning processes, these mandatory planning processes that require and call for very warranted community engagement, that is required by ULURP and by the environmental review process, is part of what's designed to be part of planning, of thinking about what you need, so that then you can engage a designer and begin building. So we think it's actually appropriate to be talking when you have some larger ideas about what you want to do, so that we can use these planning processes as they were intended to plan the process.
Thanks. I just one other question, probably of 100 questions, but the other one that plagues me, and I think many people, I don't know, is was there a study, you know, the whole idea of, you know, the acceptance that Rikers Island has to close, you know, that's absolutely, you know, 100%, we all accept it. Was there some sort of study done as to what would it would take to renovate anything at Rikers Island? You know, any of, sort of, you know, getting better transportation there, all these things. Is there a study that's published that the public can see and review and analyze in terms of the sort of essential need, specifically architecturally, to go through what we're going through in terms of finding new sites? I'm just curious about that. You know, it fascinates me that it's sort of an accepted vision to have had to close this down without having really an understanding of what would have happened had you done many of the things that you're talking about architecturally, which arguably would be a lot easier on that island than what's being proposed here. You know, even things like just, it's a completely sort of vertical community now versus one that was horizontal that has tremendous landscape and, you know, has a lot of therapeutic gardening things that are there already. And, you know, where's all that going to go in this new program? So I'm just curious, is there some sort of study that was you know, that you could share with our community board at least, because I would imagine there are people who be interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the report that the Lippman Commission put out, you know, certainly did look at those, you know, a number of those questions. You know, we didn't issue, like in terms of, you know, closing Rikers versus renovating, improvement and replacement of facilities on site. You know, we don't have a report that we did. Obviously, we looked at it. I will say that, you know, that the isolation of the Rikers Island location and the time that it takes with individuals being woken up at 3 a.m. in the morning to travel to make their court dates, you know, the fact that for
But isn't that something
visitors
that
and
could be
loved
solved
ones-
with more additional ferries, for example, and a better management on the island, for example? It's just so
So
odd to me that that's an accepted reason to trash an entire island when we're busy moving on to Governor's Island. You know, there's a lack of logic there. Forgive me, this is somewhat of a personal interest of mine, but I'll leave it at that. But
And I
it's the
appreciate
fact
your
that there is no study that was ever done on a cost analysis of what it meant to renovate on that island, add additional ferries, or even add a footbridge, strikes me as a big missing link. And the urgency to it in this particular administration and the need to do this now, and what will become of Rikers Island. Will this be a community to be developed with housing? If we were learning this was all going to be affordable housing, I'm sure people would be much more interested in this. But you know, we don't even know what is going to go there. And so I just find these are bigger questions that I think should be answered.
I think we'd be happy to have a larger conversation about that.
Mr. Chairman, if you'll excuse me, I think we've had enough discussion. We have a very important resolution coming up, and I hope everyone stays here so that we can do it. I think they got what we're talking about, and I don't think much more talk is
I'd like to let her answer the
aid.
question, and then we have a couple of folks from the...
I don't think any more talking on this subject will aid the topic at all. That's my personal opinion.
All right, thank you. You can answer.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just like quickly wrap up and say that there are some things such as, you know, we have tried to, you know, provided free shuttle bus services to Rikers Island to try to, you know, make it easier for visitation, right? So that's something that didn't exist, and that, you know, now there's shuttle bus services from Manhattan and in Harlem and downtown Brooklyn. I think that, and again, if it is of help, maybe not to the whole committee, but if there's some people who are interested in this, we would welcome a larger conversation on this. And I think really that in this case, some of the perspectives and voices of people who have experienced the challenges of visiting their loved ones on Rikers Island, and just the insufficiency of even the best public transportation options that we try to provide, the difference in having to take a day off to visit a loved one, even with better transportation and all of that, that the isolation really is not something that we believe we could overcome, but we welcome a larger conversation on it.
Thank you.
All right, so Valentina Jones from the Lower East Side Power Partnership, I know you wanted to speak, if you could keep it brief, please.
Who is this? Patrick?
She'll explain.
Lower East Side Power Partnership.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Valentina Jones. I'm a registered nurse, a licensed mental health counselor, and a credentialed alcohol and substance abuse counselor. I've lived on the Lower East Side for more than 50 years. I worked at the House of Detention, I think when I was 15 as a summer youth court job. I think I came last month to your full board meeting because I think your September resolution said CB1 emphatically opposes the suggestion that the required ULURP action for this issue cover all 4 boroughs involved in the proposed facilities. And I talked to the 2 of you, and you had said that I came because we would support that. And I was told that it wasn't actually needed, so.
Well, it is now.
So I was like, okay. And so then the other thing that I had heard at that point was that they were probably going to start the ULURP process March 25th. So I said it was vital that we come at this point. So one of our first things, I'm just going to briefly go over this, one of our first things was that there be meaningful community engagement about the location. So we sent a letter on December 21st. Our group is mainly retired registered nurses and retired other people in human services. So one of the issues for people in our group was that a portion of any revenues generated by utilization of land on Rikers Island be used to fund community programming. This was a very big issue with our group. For some reason, I don't know what references people had, they felt that this land at Rikers would probably be used for some condominiums down the road, and they wanted to make sure that if they put some condominiums there, that there was something in writing from the very beginning that said that if there's anything built, and not to say they have to, will, or won't, that this community would get some kind of compensation for that annually. So in terms of community, that was one thing that we advocated for in terms of community in our letter. We advocated also for GED and job training for all ages, because what we had saw at that time was, as they're showing now, there's a community section. And so one of the things, if you read anything about who generally is detained, is generally a lot of times people that don't have a GED. And we also advocated for prevention programs for middle and high school students, because we assumed that if you're talking about a community space, you want young people that are able to get to that space. So you don't really want to do elementary school, but you might want to do middle school, etc., in terms of some type of prevention program. We also advocated for across generations health and wellness services, including technology, education, in terms of the community space. In terms of the fact is, if they do something and we need to state what it is that we want in terms of a community service, we just looked at these as very, very general and assumed that this community would look at the community itself to determine anything much more specific. So in terms of reform, oversight, and as I've heard, culture change, we advocated for a community advisory board. We advocated for improvement in staffing patterns, because that to me right away is a big issue. It will not be any better if you have the same staffing that could not do the job on Rikers if you have another facility and you have the same kind of staffing pattern. So our encouragement would be that the staff is asked what would be a good staffing pattern? Because I know if somebody asked me, I've worked emergency room and various services, would say orthopedics, I've never worked. If you ask me about orthopedics, I would say go ask the staff that works that particular service. So that was what we said there. One of the major points, and I think that, once again, your resolution from September 25th, it says, one of the whereases, where reports of daily humiliation and occasional acts of shock and brutality befell detainees who are far from family and social services. Our group really felt that an independent auditor is definitely needed here to review the tapes. And one of the things that's very clear, the New York State Department of Substance Abuse, the Office of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Services, they have a mandated reporting webinar. And one of the things they say there's fear of retaliation or perceived as a tattletale or snitch. That very often other people that work with folks that are doing abusive things are not generally going to report them. And this is from the New York State Office of Alcohol and Substance Abuse Services. So anyway, that was what people felt. So what we have beyond that, you can just read it over. It's basically about reform and the culture there. But we kind of assume that that's probably not going to be a lot of what the ULURP is going to be about. That probably in terms of mitigation, it would probably be much more towards the community section at the top. So we just wanted to do this, but we know that once the ULURP is out, which supposedly will be March 25th, that there will be additional opportunity to say something, present something, etc.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Carl? Yeah.
I'm wondering why 124 White Street has not been part of the discussion, and what is the plan?
Why
124 White Street.
It is, so the plan is currently that it would be to demolish and replace both 124 and 125 White Street. Both the existing north and south towers of Manhattan Detention Center, so it will be both 124 and 125 White Street.
The picture you show is only 125, as I can seems to me. So what's at 124?
Which picture?
The housing one.
Sorry. So 124 and 125 White Street, so both NBC north and south. So this is 100 Center Street there, that's White Street. So the building is going to straddle both sides.
It straddles White Street. Correct. I see.
So the building goes straight across White Street.
Over White Street, correct.
Over, but the White Street still exists.
Yeah, there'll be like an arch.
It's going to be an open
Arcade.
arcade.
Open arcade, right?
Let's take two more questions, then we're done. So I see these two gentlemen.
Lovely.
So I had a question
Can you just
about...
introduce yourself first?
Hi, my name's Dan.
For the record.
I had a question about existing facilities, since I know that these are in the planning stages. I don't know if this is better answered by Dana or Matthew, but one question, it's kind of a two-part single question, and one question is the ongoing crisis. I know that this is a federal facility and not a state or city-controlled facility, but I know that the ongoing crisis of the MDC right now is sort of a reminder that the second there is an aberration to the functioning and the maintenance and the design of a facility, there is liable to be a escalation of the sort of standard kind of terrible abuse of a prison into a realm of grotesque abuse. And so I wanted to ask, what is the what is it about the site selection or the architectural planning or the design principles of the interior that would stop a correctional officer from abusing a visiting family member verbally, or using a hose on somebody who they feel is too free? The second question, the second part of this question involves the two facilities that were used as comparable sites in the September review session. I think one's in San Diego, one is in Denver, I think. And I know that there are, I know that these are a different spatial plan, but I also know that it didn't take long to find that each of those facilities have news reports or other public information regarding overcrowding, correctional officer brutality, suicide attempts, and even a Hep A outbreak. And I was wondering again, what is it about the design principles, the site selection, the architectural planning that makes these less likely when they are sort of the norm?
So one, I'll start just by saying that yes, we should all be appalled by what has happened at the NBC Federal facility, and I'm glad that, within the mayor's office, we, work to try and provide help as we can, but obviously the fact that there was so much community presence at that, and just making sure that it was aware what was going on in there, and just, that the importance of us all understanding what is happening in our justice facilities cannot be, underscored enough. So I think, it is right to uplift that and say, what can we learn from, things that we see around the country and in New York City like that. The things and the design principles that that are kind of the foundation of this, that we believe are fundamentally different are things, and these are design principles that were developed through, the work city agencies, but with focus groups, with the Justice Implementation Task Force, with as much input from staff and formerly incarcerated individuals and family members as we could possibly, as we could. And some of the things that I think are really important are programming space, recreation space, access to light, rooms for visitation, smaller housing units with better line of staff, which is better for people in detention and better, for staff safety. Those are, a more normative and respectful environment. Room for discharge planning and reentry services and medical services and outdoor recreation. All of those things are very, very important in the facilities, and I think are part of culture change. To the point of, is it just about the buildings? It's not just about the buildings, right? So if we were only focused on what are these facilities, what is the design of these facilities, in the absence of a conversation and a full commitment to, one, how do we ensure that as few people are in jail on a given day as is possible, and there's a whole host of things that we have to focus on to reduce the number of people in jail on any given day, everything from funding community-based violence prevention and neighborhood supports, and we have made pretty significant investments in that, to improving the justice system and expanding pretrial release and expanding supervised release, and supporting things such as bail reform and speedy trial and discovery reform and parole reform and, in Albany. So there's a huge amount of work that we have to work on in terms of reducing the number of people who are in detention on a given day. That's part of this plan. The other part of that is absolutely how do we change the culture of these facilities. That is not work that is, happens once the new facilities are built. That is work that is happening right now in terms of, making sure that there's 5 hours of programming for everyone in detention. Things like jails to jobs, to make sure that every person who is serving a city sentence and beyond has access to employment when they get home. Reentry planning and programs like Friends of Island Academy that are in there working with all of the young adults. Better staff training and crisis intervention training for staff. We have a culture change task force or working group that is focused on programming, staff training, wellness, and retention questions. So all of those things are very important, completely outside of how we do those, these facilities. That being said, having facilities that have programming space and light and recreation, and in terms of site selection, the criteria that we were looking for is close to the courthouses, close to public transportation, so that there was not this isolation of people who are in jail are, hours away, that you can't, that their loved ones have to take a day off from work to get them, or that they have to be woken up at 3 in the morning to go to the courts. So the site selection criteria was really about, how do we better integrate these to have justice-related goals, but also to make sure that people who are in detention aren't isolated. The program is really about what is the way that design can help support the culture change efforts that are underway. And we agree with you, the Denver facility is not a perfect model. You know, there's lots of things that we can look at. It's in the middle of a downtown urban environment, and it like looks, actually from the outside, it doesn't look like a fortress, which is what so many of our jails look like. What it's not a model though, because they don't have sufficient programming space, right? So we're looking at what are the things that we can learn from other facilities where things have been done better, right? Like the exterior, in terms of the fact that you don't walk down the street and think this is, you know, it's just barbed wire. But absolutely, it doesn't mean that across the board we're saying that every other place that we look, you know, that there are not enough models of effective justice reform in the U.S. And so, I don't know, I think.
No, it
really
does,
that answers.
so that, it kind of begs just one more
Great.
part, and then I want to move on to.
Can you be?
Come on.
We gotta go on, we gotta move on.
Yeah.
Very, very succinctly, and answer succinctly, please.
Yeah, very quickly. So, my name's Nabil for the record. So, you've come to this community board and the other one saying that you need these people to vote, or you want them to give a recommendation to build these thousands of new cages so that you can close Rikers. But what guarantee is there that Rikers will actually close once de Blasio is out, because he's term limited in 2021?
So I think that, and I know that that's a question that a lot of people obviously, you know, have, is how do we ensure that, you know, we're not, the whole point of this is not to add capacity to the criminal justice system. The whole point of this is to move from a system of 11 jails, which we currently have, and a capacity of about 12,000 detention beds on a given day, to a capacity that is less than half the size of that. You know, we at the mayor's office are committed to, you know, advancing this plan, and to the, you know, to the extent possible under this administration, and that is, you know, getting through the public approval process and obviously being able to do that RFP for the design build stream, while making sure that we can integrate community input. I think the fact that there is broad recognition across this city and broad public support for the, you know, the fact that this is about the closure of the jails on Rikers Island, means that that same type of community engagement and input will be necessary, certainly down the line, to make sure that we are, you know, that what we have at the end of the day is a smaller jail system. I think that this is, you know, we've seen elected officials across the board recognizing that this is the right way to go, and there's a better way for our public safety system. I have hope, especially with the level of sustained community engagement that we have, that the next administration will see the importance and the need of making sure that, you know, we don't have more people in jail, and that the jails in Rikers Island are closed, and that we're not backsliding from all the reforms that have happened to date.
So you have no guarantee, you have hope. Is that right?
We're going to move on, guys. Thanks very much, Dana. Thank you, Gabby. Thank you, everybody who came to present. We'll see you guys next month. All right. We just need to tee up a conference call for the next, the final item on our agenda.
Is there a resolution on this one?
Yes.
There is a resolution.
On the next one that's coming up?
Yep, it's on renewing and strengthening New York State's tenant laws stabilization.
By the way,
The ultimate plan is to fill in
The church long enough.
have a second to fill in part of
I think it seems like everybody's ready.
Maybe. You're right. The optimum soundproofing. Oh, replace, yes.
Hi, Thomas, Diana. Oh, and everybody else. We're transitioning between items here, so just hang tight for a second, okay?
Okay, everybody, we're going to move on to our last item, so if you're having conversations, please take them in the hall. We have a member of the committee who's on the phone, who's going to introduce our next and final resolution. I wouldn't try to do violence to this thing by summarizing it on my own, so I'm going to ask Tom Goodkind, who's joining us via conference call, to tee us up. Hi, Tom.
Hi, everyone. Sorry I haven't been very well lately.
I'm not sure you guys can hear him.
Type this resolution.
I don't know if that's going to work.
Listen close.
In between hospital visits, just sounds rather morbid. Anyway, it's for the good. You wrote a very similar resolution 5 years ago. It's our take on how we as a community, not necessarily the remainder of New York, some of it does apply to all of New York, can renew and strengthen and protect our tenants when it comes to mainly stabilization. Not affordability, but stabilization. And I think many of you know the difference here. There are 4 points that constantly come up in our area, one of which is absolutely citywide, that I think our local elected officials really know a lot about, which is, and if you can go to the second page, it's second, therefore be it resolved. We'll just get to the end. You've been through a long meeting, and I've been waiting for 2 hours. Look, the preferential rent law. Now, does anyone feel like having this explained, or do you sort of know what it is?
I know I think most of us around the table know what the preferential law is. Yes, no?
Yes. It allows for large increases.
Yeah.
It also allows for a landlord to set what they call rack rates for an apartment that are unusually high, and they offer the tenant a lower preferential rate, but leave the stated quote-unquote what they purview advertise as a market rate very, very high. And oftentimes it's 3-4 times the actual value, but it's how they get around being able to destabilize the apartment and charge more rents.
That's a really good explanation. And there have been leaders of our community who've actually had to move out of the neighborhood. I'm not going to say who it is, but this has struck us in removing community members, and that they're paying a nice low rent, and upon renewal, it goes back up to stabilization rate, and they can't afford that. What we're asking here is that if you're given, this was with the Tacky-Bruno law, there was an amendment to the law in 1993, and we're trying to get rid of this thing, so that if you're given a nice low rent, the rent upon renewal goes up in the exact amount that's negotiated between landlords and tenants over at Cooper Union, not to an unaffordable rate. That's all. We asked for it previously in 2014, but the Senate wouldn't vote it in. We have a good feeling that's going to pass this time with the new Senate. So that's number one. Number two that we're going for is that there's a new 421A. Now, 421A is a lot of almost all of our stabilized buildings were built with a 421A tax abatement, which gives a certain amount of years of no tax at all. So the owners are saving millions on tax. And meanwhile, the building's under full stabilization, which, may not be the greatest, but at least your rents don't go way up. Maybe economically forcing you out. Also, it asks for some affordable housing inside the 421A. It's typically anywhere between 5 and 20%. It's a little higher now with our new mayor. And it had allowed 50% preference to our own neighborhood. So if you retired and wanted to stay in the neighborhood you helped build, or your kids live nearby for whatever reason, or you want your children to live near you, there's a 50% preference for people living in the neighborhood to the affordable section, which is very nice. In the middle of last year, for some reason, they got rid of the 50% preference, which was startling. There was very little fanfare on it. We had 2 visitors to our housing committee who confirmed this, who were with the government. And the stabilization for the 70% of the other part of the building, the renters, went away. So that's now just regular rentals, and the landlords and owners can bring that amount up anytime after a lease is up. And say, hey, look, we can charge more, so that's it. So there's no more stabilization for the majority of the building. We're against all of this. We like the old 421A, where you get a full, sounds like the owners are getting a bargain, where you get full tax abatement. You still get the full tax abatement with the new 421A. But we want full stabilization for the building like we had, and we want a preference for the neighborhood. And there's been a lot of discussion on this over the last year. But this is what we're asking for, and it's not something you hear about that often, because most of the city has an older style of stabilization. Our area has predominantly 421A.
Tom, I don't want to cut you off, but we're at risk of losing our quorum and thus the ability to get this through. I think the members have now had a chance to look through the resolution, and Peter from Assemblymember News office is here. We sent this, just so everybody knows, we sent a peek of this resolution to Brian and to Yulene to get their comment. I don't know if is there anything. No update? Okay, great. So,
Is she supportive?
Let's vote.
As far as I know, she's supportive.
it's...
Unless you want to hear, I could do one line on each one. Well, sorry, I didn't
Okay,
know.
very, very quickly, and then we're
I know
gonna see if
the
anybody has
meeting.
any questions. I assume nobody has any questions, right?
No. I could call two questions.
Why don't we call the question? Sound good?
Seconded.
All right.
All in favor?
All in favor?
Any
And-
opposed?
Yeah.
Abstaining?
Thank you, Tom, for all your
Recused?
good work.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Passes unanimously, Tom. Congratulations.
You want something to pass? Put it at the end.
I hope to rejoin you guys soon.
We hope to see you
Yes.
soon, and
Thanks,
be
Tom.
well.
Yes, feel better.
Oh, that was brutal.
Yeah.
With that, we're